The phone rang at 2 in the morning, and Nathan Grant knew before he answered that something was wrong. His mother never called that late unless it mattered. "Nathan," Eleanor Grant said, her voice thin and shaking, "I fell in the kitchen. I think I twisted my ankle. I did not want to bother you, but I could not reach the counter to stand up." He was already pulling on his shoes before she finished the sentence. 20 minutes later, he was kneeling on her kitchen floor, checking her foot, feeling his own heart pound harder than it had in years. She was 71 years old and still living alone in the same small house where she had raised him, still refusing every offer he made to move her somewhere safer, somewhere easier. "I am fine," she kept insisting, even as he helped her into a chair. "You did not need to rush over here like the house was on fire." "You called me at 2 in the morning, Mom. Of course I rushed." She waved a hand at him, embarrassed, the way she always was whenever anyone paid attention to her. That was the thing about Eleanor Grant. She had spent her whole life making herself smaller so that other people could be comfortable. She never wanted to be a burden. She never wanted to take up space. And it broke something in Nathan every single time he saw it. While he wrapped an ice pack around her ankle, his eyes drifted to the small television in the corner of her living room, still playing quietly from earlier that night. An entertainment program was airing a segment about a royal event overseas, cameras following a duchess as she stepped out of a car in a gown that shimmered like liquid gold under the lights. The commentator gushed about the fabric, the tailoring, the sheer artistry of it. Eleanor glanced at the screen and let out a small, tired laugh. "Can you imagine," she said, "a woman like me in something like that? I would not even know how to walk in it." She said it lightly, the way she said most things about herself, as if it were a joke not worth taking seriously. But Nathan did not laugh. He sat very still, the ice pack forgotten in his hand, and something inside him shifted. He had heard his mother make comments like that his entire life. When he was a boy, she used to say things like, "Women like us do not go to places like that," whenever a fancy restaurant came up in conversation. When he got older and started earning real money, she still refused nice gifts, still insisted that simple was good enough for her, still flinched whenever he tried to spoil her even a little. He used to think it was modesty. Now, watching her rub her sore ankle in a chair that had seen better decades, in a house with carpet worn thin from 30 years of walking the same paths, he understood it was something deeper. She did not believe she deserved beautiful things. Somewhere along the way, life had convinced her that beauty and comfort belonged to other people, people born into a different kind of luck. Nathan had not been born into luck either. He remembered exactly what those early years looked like. He remembered his mother working 2 jobs at once, cleaning offices before dawn and waiting tables until midnight, coming home with her feet swollen and her hands cracked from cold water and industrial soap. He remembered watching her mend the same coat 3 winters in a row instead of buying a new one, telling him it still had good use left in it. He remembered the year she told him there was no money for a birthday present, and then found a way to bake him a cake anyway, using ingredients she must have skipped meals to afford. He had grown up watching a woman give away every comfort she could have kept for herself, so that he could have just a little more. Now he was 34 years old. He owned a growing logistics company that had expanded faster than even he expected, with offices in 3 cities and a client list that kept his phone buzzing at all hours. He had money now, real money, the kind of money that could have bought his mother a bigger house years ago if she had ever let him. But money was not the problem. Convincing her to accept anything was the problem. He sat beside her that night long after her ankle was wrapped and the swelling had gone down, long after she had fallen asleep in her chair with the television murmuring softly in the background. He did not leave. He sat there in the quiet, replaying her words over and over in his mind. "Can you imagine a woman like me in something like that?" It was such a small sentence. She probably would not even remember saying it by morning. But it lodged itself in his chest like a splinter, and the more he turned it over, the more it seemed to explain everything about her, every quiet sacrifice, every refused gift, every time she shrank herself down to fit into a life that had never given her enough room to stand tall. He thought about his own childhood, about the birthdays she made feel special with almost nothing, about the way she used to braid ribbon into old dresses to make them feel new again, about the pride she took in small things because small things were all she ever let herself want. She had given him a childhood that felt rich, even when their bank account said otherwise, and she had done it by convincing herself she needed nothing at all. He did not sleep that night. Not really. He sat in that small living room with its worn carpet and its second-hand furniture, watching his mother breathe slowly in her chair, and he made a decision that would take him months to carry out, though he did not know that yet. He only knew that something in her voice had cracked open a door he could not close again. He would find a way to give her something she believed was impossible, not because she needed proof of her own worth. She had already proven that every single day of her life, in 1,000 small acts of love that no gown could ever measure up to. But because she deserved, just once, to feel what it was like to be treated like she mattered, to feel the weight of fine fabric on her shoulders and know it was made for her, not borrowed, not imagined, not something that belonged to other people. The idea felt enormous and strange even as it formed in his mind. He did not know the first thing about high fashion. He did not know how someone even began to approach the kind of designers who worked with royalty. He barely knew how to pick out a proper suit for himself, relying mostly on the same tailor he had used for years, a practical man who valued function over flair. But he had built a company out of nothing before. He had learned industries he knew nothing about, made calls to people who did not want to answer, found his way through closed doors more times than he could count. He told himself this could not be so different. Somewhere out there were people who understood fabric and craftsmanship the way he understood shipping routes and supply chains. He simply needed to find them. The next morning, after making sure his mother was settled and resting with her ankle propped up, he drove home and sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, a cup of coffee going cold beside him. He typed search after search into the browser. Designers who dressed duchesses, royal gown makers, bespoke evening wear commissions. Page after page loaded with glossy photographs of women he did not recognize, wearing gowns that looked more like art installations than clothing. It was overwhelming and more than a little intimidating. These were not stores you walked into. These were ateliers with waiting lists years long, with clients who were already famous, already connected, already part of a world that Nathan had never once tried to enter. He almost closed the laptop more than once that morning, telling himself he was chasing something foolish. A grown man, spending his mornings looking up gowns instead of running his business. But then he would picture his mother's face in the dim light of the television, hear her voice again, "Can you imagine a woman like me?" And his hands would go right back to the keyboard. Somewhere in that tangle of unfamiliar names and unreachable studios, there had to be someone willing to listen. Someone who would understand why a son wanted to give his mother something the world had convinced her she could never have. He did not know yet how many doors would close in his face before he found the right one. He did not know about the skepticism he would face, the designers who would dismiss him without a second thought, the weeks he would spend being told no in a dozen polite and not so polite ways. He did not know about the woman he had not yet met, a designer with her own complicated history, who would eventually become the only person willing to take his strange and beautiful request seriously. All he knew, sitting at his kitchen table with cold coffee and a browser full of unanswered questions, was that he could not let his mother's words go unanswered. She had spent a lifetime believing that some things simply were not made for people like her. He was going to prove her wrong, one way or another, even if it took every resource he had and every ounce of patience he could find. Outside his window, the morning traffic moved past in its usual rush, ordinary and unaware, while inside Nathan Grant sat quietly plotting something that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with love. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to purpose settle into his chest, sharp and certain. He closed the laptop, picked up his phone, and made the first call. It was answered by a woman with a clipped, professional voice, the assistant to a well-known design house he had found after an hour of searching. He introduced himself, explained as plainly as he could what he was hoping to do, and asked if it would be possible to speak with someone about a custom commission. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that told him everything before she even spoke again. "I am sorry," the woman said, not unkindly but firmly. "Our design house does not typically accept private commissions of that nature. Our clients are selected through very specific channels." Nathan thanked her for her time, hung up the phone, and sat there for a long moment in the quiet of his kitchen. One call, one no. He knew there would be more before this was over. He looked out the window one more time, thinking of his mother resting at home with her ankle wrapped in ice, still insisting she did not need any fuss made over her. He picked up the phone again and dialed the next number on his list. 3 weeks passed, and Nathan's list of contacts grew longer while his list of successes stayed empty. He had called design houses in 4 different cities, sent emails to studios that specialized in formal wear, even reached out to a former client of his logistics company who once mentioned knowing someone in the fashion industry. Every conversation followed a similar pattern. Polite interest at first, curiosity about the unusual request, and then a gentle but firm refusal once they understood what he was actually asking for. The trouble, he realized, was not that people found the idea strange. Many of them seemed genuinely touched by it. The trouble was structural. The ateliers that created gowns worthy of Duchesses did not operate like ordinary businesses. They worked through referrals, through decades of relationships, through a kind of quiet exclusivity that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with who you knew. He was not short on money. He was short on the right connections, and in that world, connections were the only currency that mattered. Still, he kept working through the list, squeezing calls into gaps between his own business meetings, staying up late reading about fabric mills and hand embroidery techniques he had never known existed. He learned about silk sourced from specific regions prized for its sheen, about beadwork so detailed it could take a single artisan weeks to complete one bodice, about gowns constructed with internal bonding and structure that made them stand and move a certain way, almost like architecture built to fit a human body. The more he learned, the more he understood why these creations cost what they did, and the more determined he became to find someone willing to pour that same level of care into something for his mother. His younger cousin, Grace Whitmore, was the one who eventually gave him the lead that changed everything. Grace worked in event planning and had, over the years, coordinated a handful of charity galas that occasionally attracted designers looking for exposure. She called him one evening while he was still sitting at his kitchen table, his laptop glowing in the dark. "There is a woman named Charlotte Bennett," Grace said. "She used to work for one of the big houses in London, did private commissions for a few minor royals, actually. She left a couple of years ago to start her own studio. Smaller operation, but from what I hear, she is incredibly talented. She might actually take a call like this, especially since she is still building her own client base." Nathan wrote the name down before Grace even finished the sentence. "Do you have a way to reach her?" "I have an email. No promises, though. From what I heard, she left the big houses because she got tired of being told what kind of clients she was allowed to care about. She might respect what you are trying to do, or she might think it is a distraction from real business. You will not know until you ask." That night, Nathan wrote the most careful email he had ever composed. He rewrote it 4 times, deleting sentences that sounded too much like a sales pitch, cutting out anything that felt exaggerated or insincere. In the end, he kept it simple. He explained who his mother was, not with grand language, but with honest detail. A woman who had worked 2 jobs to raise him alone. A woman who had spent her whole life believing beautiful things were reserved for other people. A son who wanted, just once, to prove her wrong. He sent the email past midnight and closed his laptop without much hope of a quick reply. 3 days later, his phone rang with an unfamiliar international number. "Is this Nathan Grant?" The voice was crisp, precise, carrying a slight accent he could not immediately place. "This is Charlotte Bennett. I received your email. I have to admit, it is not the kind of message I usually get." Nathan sat up straighter, gripping the phone. "Thank you for calling. I know this is an unusual request." "It is," Charlotte said, and for a moment he thought she was about to end the conversation the way so many others had. Instead, she continued, "But it is also the first message I have received in a long time that made me want to pick up the phone instead of typing a polite refusal. Tell me about your mother." He talked for nearly 20 minutes, longer than he had planned, describing details he had not even shared with Grace. He told her about the coat his mother mended 3 winters in a row. He told her about the birthday cake made from ingredients she must have gone without something else to afford. He told her about the way his mother still refused new furniture, new clothes, anything that cost more than the absolute minimum, as if comfort itself were a luxury she had not earned. Charlotte listened without interrupting, and when he finally finished, there was a long pause on the line. "I left the big design houses because I grew tired of only dressing women who were already told, from the moment they were born, that they deserved beautiful things," she said finally. "I wanted to work with people who actually understood what it meant to earn something. Your mother sounds like exactly that kind of woman." Relief flooded through Nathan so quickly he almost laughed out loud. "Does that mean you will take the commission?" "It means I want to meet her, even if only through photographs and measurements at first, and understand her properly before I put a single stitch into fabric. This is not something I take lightly, Mr. Grant. A gown is not just cloth. It has to understand the woman wearing it. It has to move the way she moves, sit the way her shoulders sit, hold itself the way her spine holds itself after a lifetime of the work she has done. I do not create costumes. I create garments that belong entirely to one person." Nathan felt his throat tighten. "That is exactly what I want for her." Over the following weeks, a partnership began to form between them, built through phone calls and video meetings, through careful, honest conversation. Charlotte asked questions Nathan had never thought to consider. She wanted to know his mother's favorite colors, not the ones she claimed to like out of politeness, but the ones her eyes lingered on without realizing it. She asked about old photographs, wanting to see what Alina looked like at different points in her life, searching for some thread of the woman underneath decades of quiet sacrifice. Nathan dug through boxes in his mother's attic without her knowledge, carefully photographing pictures from decades earlier. There was one photograph in particular that caught Charlotte's attention immediately. A faded image of a young Alina at maybe 20 years old, standing outside a modest apartment building in a simple green dress, laughing at something outside the frame, her whole face lit up in a way Nathan barely remembered seeing since. "That color," Charlotte said when he sent it to her. "That exact shade of green. Look how it sits against her skin. There is something there. We start with that." It was during these early weeks that Nathan first learned the real challenge of the project would not be finding the right designer. It would be finding a way to gather the measurements and details he needed without alerting his mother to what was happening. Charlotte needed precise numbers, not just approximate guesses, and Alina was not the kind of woman who would casually allow herself to be measured for something extravagant. He solved it eventually, through a small deception he did not feel entirely proud of, but justified as necessary. He told his mother that his company was hosting a charity event later in the year, something formal, and that as part of a promotional partnership, Guests were being offered complimentary professional portraits taken by a photographer who required accurate sizing information for wardrobe styling purposes. It was a strange excuse, cobbled together on the spot, but Alina, ever trusting of her son, accepted it without much suspicion, only grumbling a little about being fussed over for a photograph she had not asked for. A stylist Charlotte trusted, working under the guise of preparing for that fictional event, visited Alina's home one afternoon and took careful measurements while chatting easily about nothing in particular, putting her at ease. Nathan waited in another room, feeling both relieved and strangely guilty, hoping the small lie would be forgiven once his mother understood the reason behind it. When the measurements arrived in Charlotte's inbox that evening, along with detailed notes about Alina's posture, her preferred fabrics against sensitive skin, the slight favoring of her left shoulder from decades of carrying heavy trays and cleaning supplies, Charlotte called Nathan immediately. "This is not going to be one gown," she told him, her voice carrying a new kind of excitement Nathan had not heard from her before. "I have been thinking about this since our first conversation. Your mother deserves more than a single beautiful moment. I want to create a collection. 3, maybe 4 gowns, each inspired by pieces I created during my years working with royal clients, each one adjusted entirely to fit her, to honor her history, her body, her story. Not replicas. Not costumes. New creations that simply borrow the spirit of those original designs." Nathan sat with the phone pressed to his ear, momentarily unable to speak. "That is more than I imagined possible," he finally managed. "Your mother's story is more than I imagined possible when I answered your email," Charlotte replied. "This will take months, Mr. Grant. Real craftsmanship cannot be rushed. But I promise you, when we are finished, she will understand that what she believed about herself was never true." Nathan hung up the phone that night and sat alone in his apartment for a long time, staring at nothing in particular, feeling the full weight of what he had set into motion. Somewhere across an ocean, a woman he had spoken to only a handful of times was beginning to sketch designs inspired by his mother's laughter in an old photograph, her favorite green dress, the quiet dignity she carried through a lifetime that had rarely given her much reason to feel proud of herself. He thought of all the closed doors, all the polite refusals, all the weeks spent wondering if this idea had been foolish from the start. It had not been foolish. It had simply been waiting for the right person to say yes. The work began in earnest in a small studio tucked into a quiet street, filled with bolts of fabric stacked from floor to ceiling, mannequins draped in half-finished pieces, and the constant hum of sewing machines running late into the evening. Charlotte Bennett worked there with a small team of 3, each of them specialists in their own right. One focused entirely on embroidery, another on structural tailoring, a third who handled fittings and adjustments with the precision of a surgeon. Nathan visited the studio for the first time nearly 6 weeks after that initial phone call. Having flown out under the pretense of a business trip, he told his mother was unrelated to anything personal. He wanted to see the work firsthand, to understand exactly what his money and his hope were being poured into. Charlotte greeted him at the door, sharp-eyed and businesslike, but there was a softness underneath her professionalism that had not been as apparent over the phone. She led him through the studio, past racks of fabric samples in every imaginable shade, until they reached a corner where 4 dress forms stood draped in muslin, rough shapes of what would eventually become finished gowns. "This is where we start," she explained, running her hand along one of the draped forms. "Muslin mock-ups. We build the structure first, the way an architect builds a frame before adding walls. Every seam, every dart, every line has to be perfect before we ever touch the real fabric. If we get this wrong, everything after it is wrong too." Nathan studied the rough shapes, trying to imagine his mother's small frame filling them out. "How do you know it will fit her properly? She has never even tried anything on." "We do not know yet," Charlotte admitted. "That is why we are flying out to see her directly next month, under whatever excuse you manage to invent this time. She allowed herself a small, dry smile. Measurements taken by a stylist can only tell us so much. A proper fitting requires her actual presence, her actual movement. I need to see how she carries herself when she believes no one important is watching. That tells me more than any measuring tape ever could. The idea sent a spike of nervous energy through Nathan's chest. Arranging a home visit without his mother realizing its true purpose would require a more elaborate story than the one he had used before, and he was already running out of believable excuses. Over the following weeks, as the muslin mock-ups slowly transformed into structured foundations for the first gown, Nathan worked on solving that particular problem. He eventually settled on an idea born from something his mother had mentioned in passing months earlier. An offhand comment about how she had always wondered what it might be like to have her portrait properly painted, the way she had seen done for wealthy families in old films. It had been said as a joke, the same way she joked about the Duchess's gown, but Nathan remembered it, and he built his cover story around it. He told his mother that he had commissioned a portrait artist as an early birthday surprise, one who preferred to work from careful observation rather than photographs alone, and that the artist would need to visit her at home for a series of sittings to properly capture her likeness. Alina protested, of course, insisting it was an unnecessary expense, that no one needed a painting of an old woman who had never done anything worth memorializing. But Nathan held firm, framing it as something he wanted for himself, a way to have her captured properly while she was still healthy and vibrant. And eventually she relented, grumbling the entire time about her son wasting money on foolish things. Charlotte arrived a month later, introduced to Alina as the portrait artist, sketchbook in hand, moving through the house with quiet, careful attention that Alina mistook entirely for artistic study. In truth, Charlotte was observing everything that mattered to her actual work. The way Alina's shoulders curved slightly forward from decades of leaning over counters and trays. The particular way she held her hands, fingers slightly curled from years of scrubbing and lifting. The way she moved through her small kitchen with practiced efficiency, never wasting a single step, every motion economical and precise. She moves like someone who has spent her whole life making sure she takes up as little space as possible, Charlotte told Nathan quietly, once Alina had stepped out of the room to make tea. I need the gowns to change that. Not just cover her, but give her permission to take up space. The structure has to lift her shoulders without forcing them, has to let her stand the way she probably stood as a young woman, before the world convinced her to shrink. Nathan watched his mother return with a tray of tea and biscuits, insisting Charlotte eat something before continuing her sketches, still entirely unaware that the woman studying her so intently was measuring the exact curve of her spine for a garment that would soon change how the world saw her, and perhaps how she saw herself. The sittings continued over 3 separate visits, each one giving Charlotte more information than the last. She noted the particular blue of Alina's eyes, brighter than photographs suggested, especially when she laughed at something Nathan said. She noted the calluses on her palms, evidence of a lifetime of labor that no amount of fine fabric should ever try to hide, but rather honor. She noted the small, private smile Alina wore when she thought no one was watching her. A smile Nathan recognized from childhood, the one she used to wear while humming old songs as she cleaned the house on quiet Sunday mornings. Back at the studio, work accelerated. The first gown took shape slowly, built around that faded photograph of Alina at 20, laughing outside her old apartment in a simple green dress. Charlotte and her team transformed that simple memory into something extraordinary, deep emerald silk that shifted in the light. A fitted bodice structured to lift and support without ever feeling restrictive. A skirt that fell in soft, deliberate folds designed to move the way fabric moves in old photographs of women dancing, laughing, living fully in a single captured moment. The embroidery specialist spent nearly 3 weeks on delicate beadwork along the neckline, small clusters of crystal and thread, meant to catch light the way morning dew catches sunlight on grass. a detail Charlotte insisted on after learning that Eleanor used to walk to her early morning cleaning job through a park, watching sunrise light hit the wet grass before anyone else was awake to see it. These details will not mean anything to most people who see her wearing it, Charlotte explained to Nathan during one of his visits. But they will mean everything to her, even if she does not consciously realize why. That is the difference between a costume and something made specifically for one person's history. The second gown drew inspiration from a royal design Charlotte had once created years earlier for a client attending an important state function. A structured ivory piece with clean architectural lines that commanded quiet authority without excess. For Eleanor, Charlotte reimagined it in a deep sapphire blue, the same shade Nathan remembered his mother mentioning once as her favorite color from childhood, before life had taught her to stop mentioning favorites at all. The structure honored her posture rather than fighting it, tailored precisely to the measurements taken during those quiet sitting sessions, designed to make her stand taller without ever feeling foreign against her body. A third gown, softer and more romantic in nature, borrowed elements from a design originally created for a garden ceremony years earlier, translated now into warm, dusty, rose fabric with delicate layered sleeves, something Charlotte described as a gown meant for dancing, for laughing loudly, for finally letting herself be seen without apology. The fourth and final piece became, unexpectedly, the most meaningful of them all. Charlotte had learned during one of the sitting sessions that Eleanor still owned the coat she had mended 3 separate winters, the one Nathan had mentioned in his very first message, kept folded away in a closet for reasons Eleanor herself could not fully explain. Charlotte asked to see it during a later visit, examining the careful, uneven stitches Eleanor had used to repair it herself decades earlier, small imperfect lines that told an entire story of survival and love. "I want to work fabric from this coat into the final gown," Charlotte told Nathan afterward, her voice unusually quiet. Not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but somewhere in the structure, close to her heart. She spent years protecting herself and her son with this coat. I think it deserves to become part of something that finally protects and honors her instead. Nathan had to step outside the studio for several minutes after hearing that, standing alone in the cool evening air, overwhelmed by an emotion he had not expected to feel so strongly over a piece of fabric. It was not simply about a gown anymore. It had become something closer to an act of translation, turning decades of quiet sacrifice into something his mother could finally hold in her hands, wear against her skin, and understand as proof that her life had mattered, that her love had been seen. Months passed in this careful, painstaking rhythm. Fittings, adjustments, careful conversations disguised as portrait sessions, late-night calls between Nathan and Charlotte discussing details most people would never think to consider. Slowly, 4 gowns took shape, each one carrying a piece of Eleanor's history stitched invisibly into its structure, each one designed not to transform her into someone else, but to finally reflect the woman she had always been, the one the world had rarely paused long enough to properly see. As the final fittings approached completion, Nathan began planning the moment he had been building toward from the very beginning, the day his mother would finally understand that everything, the fake portrait sessions, the elaborate excuses, the months of careful secrecy, had all led to this. He wanted it to be perfect. He wanted her to feel, if only for one evening, exactly how it felt to be treated like she deserved every beautiful thing this world had ever convinced her belonged to someone else. Charlotte, for her part, insisted on one final detail before the gowns could be considered complete. "I want to be there when she sees them for the first time," she told Nathan during their last planning call. "Not for credit, not for recognition. I simply want to witness the moment this work finally means something beyond fabric and thread." Nathan agreed without hesitation. After everything Charlotte had poured into this project, she had more than earned the right to witness its ending. All that remained now was finding the right moment, the right setting, the right way to finally pull back the curtain on months of careful secrecy and reveal to Alina Grant exactly what her son had built in her honor. Nathan chose his mother's 72nd birthday as the moment to reveal everything, reasoning that if there was ever an occasion that could justify a grand gesture without immediately arousing her suspicion, it was this one. Alina had never cared much for celebrating her own birthday, always insisting it was a waste of fuss and money. But Nathan had spent years gently pushing past her protests to mark the day with at least a quiet dinner. And this year he told her he wanted to do something a little bigger, a small gathering of close family and a few old friends at a private event space he had rented for the evening. She resisted, as expected, telling him repeatedly that a simple dinner at her own kitchen table would have been more than enough. But Nathan held firm, and eventually she agreed, mostly, he suspected, because she did not want to disappoint him on a day he seemed unusually invested in. What Alina did not know was that the event space Nathan had rented was not simply a venue for a birthday dinner. It had been arranged weeks in advance with Charlotte Bennett's full involvement, transformed quietly that afternoon into something closer to a private unveiling, elegant but understated, warm lighting, and simple flowers, arranged around a small raised platform near one end of the room, deliberately unremarkable enough that Alina would not question its presence when she first walked in. Family began arriving early that evening. Nathan's aunt, Vivian Marsh, Alina's younger sister, and one of the few people who had known small pieces of Nathan's plan from the very beginning, arrived with a knowing smile she struggled to keep hidden. A handful of old friends from the neighborhood, where Alina had lived for decades, filtered in as well, women who had known her through the hardest years, who understood without being told exactly how much this evening might come to mean. Alina arrived fashionably late, as she always insisted on being, dressed in a simple navy dress she had owned for years, her hair carefully done for the occasion, looking every bit the humble, unassuming woman she had always been. She greeted everyone with warm hugs and gentle scolding about how unnecessary all of this fuss truly was, clearly moved despite her protests by the sight of so many familiar faces gathered in one place for her. Dinner passed pleasantly, filled with easy laughter and old stories, the kind of gathering that felt comfortable and warm rather than formal or stiff. Nathan watched his mother throughout the meal, nodding the way she kept glancing around the room with quiet disbelief, clearly touched by the effort even as she continued insisting she did not deserve it. As dessert was cleared away, Nathan stood, tapping his glass gently to draw the room's attention. His heart was pounding harder than it had during any business presentation he had ever given. "Mom," he began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I want to tell you a story before we finish tonight." Alina looked up at him with the same patient, slightly embarrassed expression she always wore whenever attention turned toward her. "A few months ago," Nathan continued, "you said something to me that you probably do not even remember saying. We were sitting in your living room, late at night, and something came on the television about a woman wearing a beautiful gown at some formal event. And you laughed and said, 'Can you imagine a woman like me in something like that?'" He watched recognition flicker across his mother's face, followed quickly by confusion about why he was bringing it up now, in front of everyone. "I have thought about that sentence almost every day since you said it," Nathan went on. "Because I have spent my whole life watching you believe that beautiful things, comfortable things, things that make a person feel special, were meant for someone else. Not for you. Never for you. And I have spent my whole life watching you give away every single comfort you could have kept for yourself, so that I could have just a little bit more." Alina's eyes were beginning to shine, her hands pressed together tightly in her lap, clearly unsure where this speech was heading but already feeling its weight. "I could never repay everything you sacrificed for me," Nathan continued, his own voice growing thick. "But I wanted, just once, to prove you wrong about what you deserve. So a few months ago, I found someone who could help me do that." He nodded toward the far end of the room, where a curtain had been quietly drawn across the small, raised platform earlier without Alina noticing. Charlotte Bennet stepped forward from where she had been waiting near the back of the room, dressed simply but elegantly, her expression a careful mixture of professional composure and genuine emotion. "Mom, this is Charlotte. She is one of the most talented designers I have ever met, someone who has spent years creating gowns for duchesses and other important women around the world. I asked her to make something for you, not something borrowed, not a costume, something built entirely around who you are." Alina's hand flew to her mouth, disbelief written plainly across her face as she looked between her son and the stranger standing near the curtained platform. "Nathan," she whispered, "what did you do?" "I wanted you to know what it feels like to be seen the way you have always seen everyone else," he said simply. Charlotte stepped forward gently, offering her hand to help Alina rise from her chair, and led her, still trembling slightly, toward the platform. With careful ceremony, she drew back the curtain. 4 gowns stood displayed before her, each on its own form, lit softly from above. The deep emerald green gown caught the light first, its beaded neckline shimmering like scattered dew. Beside it stood the sapphire blue piece, structured and dignified, followed by the soft dusty rose gown with its delicate layered sleeves. And at the end stood the 4th gown, warm ivory fabric with something subtle and different about its construction that Alina could not immediately place. Alina stood frozen, one hand still pressed against her chest, staring at the gowns as though she could not fully process what she was seeing. "These were inspired by pieces I created during my years designing for royal clients," Charlotte explained gently. "But none of them are copies. Each one was built specifically around you, Mrs. Grant. Your measurements, your history, your favorite colors from a lifetime ago that your son remembered even when you had forgotten mentioning them yourself." She gestured toward the emerald gown. "This color comes from a photograph of you at 20 years old, laughing outside your old apartment. Your son found it and could not stop talking about how alive you looked in that moment." She moved to the sapphire piece. "This blue is the color you once told him was your favorite, long before you convinced yourself that favorites were things you no longer had time for." Finally, she gestured toward the ivory gown at the end. "And this one," she said quietly, "contains fabric from a coat you mended 3 separate winters rather than allow yourself something new. Your son told me that story, and I could not imagine creating anything for you without honoring it directly. That fabric sits now near the heart of this gown, close to you, the way it once kept you and your son warm through years neither of you ever complained about out loud." Alina's composure finally broke completely. Tears streamed freely down her face as she reached out with trembling fingers to touch the fabric of the emerald gown nearest her, as though she needed physical proof that it was real, that any of this was truly meant for her. "I do not understand," she whispered, though her voice suggested she understood perfectly well and simply could not yet accept it. "Why would anyone go through all this trouble for me?" "Because you spent your whole life going through every kind of trouble for me," Nathan said, standing beside her now, his own eyes wet. "And I wanted you to finally know what it feels like on the other side of that kind of love." The room had gone completely silent except for Alina's quiet crying, family and friends watching with their own eyes shining, several dabbing at tears they had not expected to shed that evening. Charlotte gently encouraged Alina to step behind a modest dressing screen set up nearby, offering to help her try on the emerald gown, the very first piece created for her, built from the photograph of her younger self laughing without a single care in the world. Alina disappeared behind the screen, still shaking her head in disbelief, murmuring something about how none of this could possibly be happening. When she emerged several minutes later, the room fell into stunned, reverent silence. The gown fit her perfectly, every seam and structure exactly as Charlotte had designed it, lifting her shoulders gently without forcing them, allowing her to stand taller than anyone in that room had seen her stand in years. The emerald silk caught the light with every small movement, the beaded neckline sparkling softly against her collarbone. She looked, for the first time perhaps in decades, entirely like herself, but somehow more fully realized, as though the gown had simply given permission for something that had always existed underneath to finally step forward. Vivian Marsh was the first to speak, her voice cracking with emotion. "Eleanor, you look like you stepped straight out of that old photograph." Eleanor turned slowly toward the small mirror Charlotte's assistant had wheeled out beside the platform, and stood staring at her own reflection for a long, quiet moment. Her hand rose slowly to touch the fabric at her shoulder, tracing the careful stitching there, tears still slipping silently down her cheeks. "I do not recognize myself," she finally whispered, though the smallest, most genuine smile had begun to spread across her face. "You do," Nathan said softly, coming to stand beside her reflection in the mirror. "You have just never let yourself look this closely before." Eleanor turned away from the mirror and pulled her son into a fierce, tearful embrace, holding him the way she used to hold him as a small boy after a hard day. Except this time, it was Nathan offering comfort disguised as celebration, gratitude disguised as a gift. Decades of unspoken love finally given physical form in silk and thread and careful, patient craftsmanship. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter and tears, family members taking turns admiring the remaining gowns, Eleanor eventually trying on each one while Charlotte quietly explained the story behind every detail, every color, every carefully chosen fabric. By the time the evening ended, Eleanor Grant had transformed, if only for a few hours, into a woman who finally understood that she had always deserved beautiful things, that her worth had never depended on how little she allowed herself to want. But the true transformation, Nathan would come to realize in the months that followed, was only just beginning. In the weeks that followed her birthday celebration, Nathan noticed small changes in his mother that took him by surprise. She began wearing brighter colors during ordinary weekday visits, small touches that hinted at a woman slowly giving herself permission to want more than the bare minimum. She replaced the worn kitchen curtains she had kept for over a decade, finally admitting they had faded past the point of usefulness. She even allowed him, without much protest, to help her plan a proper renovation of her small bathroom, something she had needed for years but always insisted was an unnecessary expense. The gowns themselves did not remain locked away in a closet, preserved only as precious memories of a single extraordinary evening, though Nathan had half expected they might. Instead, Eleanor surprised everyone by finding genuine occasions to wear them. She wore the sapphire blue gown to a formal dinner honoring longtime employees of a local charity organization where she had volunteered for years. Standing taller among women who had never once looked twice in her direction before, she wore the dusty rose gown to Vivian's 60th birthday celebration, laughing and dancing in a way Nathan had not seen from her since he was a small child. The emerald gown, the very first piece, she reserved for what she called her own private tradition. Once each year, on the anniversary of that birthday reveal, she would put it on alone in her bedroom, simply to sit quietly and remember the evening her son had finally shown her, beyond any doubt, exactly how deeply she had been loved and valued all along. The ivory gown, the one containing fabric from her old mended coat, she never wore publicly at all. Instead, she kept it displayed carefully in her bedroom on a simple wooden form Nathan had commissioned specifically for that purpose, a quiet, constant reminder of everything that gown represented. She told Nathan once, months later, that she liked knowing it was there, close to her, the same way that old coat had once been close to her during the hardest years of her life, except now it stood not as a symbol of struggle, but of survival transformed into something beautiful. Charlotte Bennett's small studio, meanwhile, experienced an unexpected shift following the story of Eleanor's gowns. Word spread slowly at first, through mutual friends and family members who had witnessed that birthday evening, then more widely after Vivian, Unable to contain her pride, shared photographs, and a brief account of the story within her own social circles. Charlotte began receiving inquiries from other people, sons and daughters wanting to commission similar gestures for mothers and grandmothers who had spent their own lives believing beautiful things belonged only to other people. She built, over the following 2 years, an entirely new branch of her business around exactly this kind of work, moving away from exclusive royal commissions towards something she described as far more meaningful, creating garments for ordinary women whose extraordinary lives had rarely been properly honored. She often told Nathan, during occasional calls they continued long after the original project ended, that meeting Alina Grant had changed the entire direction of her career, that she finally understood the difference between dressing status and dressing dignity. Nathan himself found the experience changing him in ways he had not fully anticipated when he first sat in his kitchen, searching desperately for any designer willing to answer his strange request. He began paying closer attention to the quiet sacrifices still happening around him, noticing them in ways he had perhaps overlooked before, too busy building his company to fully recognize the small, unspoken forms of love happening in front of him every day. He started a modest scholarship fund through his company later that year, quietly named after his mother, though she never fully understood why, offering financial support to working mothers pursuing further education or trade certifications while raising children alone, the way Alina once had, without any safety net beneath her. He never publicized it widely, never sought recognition for it, choosing instead to let it exist quietly in the background of his company's operations, much the way his own mother had spent decades quietly ensuring he had everything he needed without ever drawing attention to her own sacrifices. Alina eventually agreed to finally move into a smaller, more manageable home closer to Nathan, though she insisted on choosing it herself, a modest but comfortable house with a garden she had always secretly wanted, something she finally allowed herself to want out loud instead of burying beneath decades of practiced modesty. She kept a special closet there for the 4 gowns, carefully maintained, occasionally taking them out simply to admire the careful stitching, still sometimes shaking her head in quiet disbelief that any of it had truly happened. On quiet evenings, when Nathan visited for dinner, they often found themselves returning to that late-night phone call that had started everything, the twisted ankle, the murmuring television, the single offhand sentence that changed the course of months of both their lives. Alina liked to tease him gently about the elaborate lies he told to arrange those secret fitting sessions, the fictional portrait artist, the excuses about promotional photography events that never actually existed. "You could have just asked me," she said once, laughing over a cup of tea in her new kitchen. "I might have said yes if you had explained it properly from the start." Nathan considered this for a moment before shaking his head. "I do not think you would have. I think you would have found a dozen reasons why it was unnecessary, why the money should go somewhere more practical, why you did not need anything so extravagant. You have spent your whole life refusing things meant for you. I did not want to give you the chance to refuse this." Alina grew quiet at that, staring down at her tea for a long moment before finally nodding slowly. "You are probably right," she admitted softly. "I think some part of me still does not fully believe I deserved it, even now, even after everything. But when I wear them, even just for a little while, I remember what you said that night, that I deserved to know what it felt like to be seen. I think I am finally starting to understand what you meant." Nathan reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand that had once scrubbed office floors before dawn, waited tables late into cold nights, mended coats through 3 difficult winters, so that her son could have just a little more warmth, a little more comfort, a little more chance at a better life than the one she had been given. "You have always deserved it, Mom," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to finally feel it too." Years later, long after the initial excitement of that birthday evening had settled into quiet, ordinary memory, Alina Grant still kept those 4 gowns carefully preserved in her closet, each one representing something far larger than fabric and thread. They represented every quiet sacrifice finally acknowledged, every unspoken love finally given voice, every version of herself she had spent a lifetime believing did not deserve space in the world finally allowed to stand tall and be seen. She never became a duchess, never attended a royal ball, never lived the kind of life those glossy magazines and late-night television programs like to showcase. But she learned something far more valuable during those months of secret fittings and careful craftsmanship, something her son had understood long before she did. Dignity was never about titles or crowns or borrowed grandeur. It had always belonged to her, earned through every difficult year, every quiet sacrifice, every ounce of love poured into raising a son.